racist judge humiliated a black woman by forcing her to sing in court, thinking it would break her. But when she opened her mouth, her response didn't just silence the courtroom. It shattered his authority and exposed a shocking truth that no one saw coming. The courtroom buzzed with subdued murmurs as people filtered in, their footsteps echoing on the polished wooden floor. The air was heavy, not just with the smell of old books and varnished wood, but with tension. A tension that always seemed to hang in Judge Bernard Whitaker's courtroom. Judge Whitaker, a tall man with a stern, weathered face and icy blue eyes, sat perched on his bench, his gavel resting nearby like a weapon waiting to be wielded. He had built a reputation for his unrelenting demeanor, but for the black community in this small southern town, his name was synonymous with fear. He was known for his harsh sentences, dismissive attitude, and an undercurrent of prejudice that no one dared challenge outright. That morning, all eyes turned as the heavy courtroom doors swung open. Angela Rivers walked in, her head held high, though her steps were steady and deliberate. Angela was a young black woman in her late 20s, her caramel skin glowing under the courtroom's harsh fluorescent lights. Her dark curls framed her face, and her expression revealed a mix of quiet dignity and subtle defiance. She had grown up in this town, and like many others, she knew what it meant to stand before Judge Whitaker. Angela clutched her bag tightly, her knuckles white against the strap. She was here for what should have been a simple dispute over a small traffic violation, a case so minor it barely deserved the court's attention. But she had heard whispers of what Whitaker had done to others who dared to speak up, dared to challenge his authority. As she approached the defendant's table, Angela felt the weight of the room pressing against her. She noticed the smirks on the faces of the judge's aides, the disinterested glances from court officials, and the smug expressions of those who believed this would be another routine humiliation. A black woman put in her place by a man who had the power to ruin lives with the stroke of a pen. The session began. Judge Whitaker adjusted his glasses and peered down at Angela, his voice dripping with condescension. "Miss Rivers," he drawled, "do you understand why you're here today?" Angela met his gaze, her tone measured. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm here to contest a traffic ticket I believe was issued in error." Whitaker's lips curled into a thin, mocking smile. "In error, you say? Interesting. Let's see if your argument holds up under scrutiny." He leaned back in his chair, clasping his hands together as if settling in for entertainment. Angela calmly presented her case, laying out evidence with precision. She spoke about how the ticket had been issued for running a stop sign at an intersection where no stop sign existed. She showed photographs, maps, and even cited witness statements. But Whitaker wasn't listening. He was scanning the courtroom, looking for cracks in her confidence, waiting for a moment to strike. When she finished, he leaned forward, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Well, Miss Rivers," he began, his words slow and deliberate, "you're quite the storyteller. But I have to wonder, do you think your performance is convincing anyone here?" Angela's heart pounded, but her face remained calm. She had prepared for this. "Your Honor, I've presented the facts. I trust they speak for themselves." Whitaker chuckled, a low, cold sound that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "Facts? Let's see if you can follow orders, as well as you can weave tales." He gestured toward her, his expression darkening. "I've decided to make this session a bit more educational. Stand up." Angela hesitated, confusion flashing across her face. "Excuse me, Your Honor." "You heard me," he snapped, his voice rising. "Stand up. I want to see if you can follow a simple instruction." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, disbelief rippling through the audience. Angela rose slowly, her knees trembling, but her posture resolute. Whitaker's smile widened, his tone dripping with venom. "Now, since you seem to enjoy telling stories, let's see how well you can sing one. Sing for this courtroom, Miss Rivers." A collective gasp swept through the room. Angela's breath caught in her throat as she stared at him, her mind racing. She could feel the humiliation he intended to inflict, the power he held over her, and the silent judgment of the spectators around her. Whitaker leaned forward, his voice cruel and taunting. "Come on, Miss Rivers. Show us your talent. Or are you too afraid to perform when the spotlight is on you?" Angela's fists clenched at her sides. Tears burned behind her eyes. but she refused to let them fall. The weight of history, of her ancestors who had endured countless injustices, pressed against her chest. She looked at the judge, then at the faces of those in the courtroom, and finally, at the dusty floor beneath her feet. In that moment, Angela made a decision. She would not break. The room felt suffocatingly still as Angela took a deep breath, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Every eye was fixed on her, waiting to see if she would comply. Judge Whittaker leaned back in his chair, his smirk widening as if he had already won. But Angela was no stranger to moments like this. She thought of her grandmother, a woman who had marched for civil rights, who had once been spat on for daring to sit at a whites-only lunch counter. "Don't let them take your dignity," her grandmother used to say. Those words echoed now, strengthening Angela's resolve. She straightened her back and lifted her chin. "You want me to sing, Your Honor?" Her voice was calm but carried an unmistakable weight, each word deliberate. The judge's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flicker of confusion. He hadn't expected her to confront him so directly. "Yes, Miss Rivers. Show us what you're made of." Angela glanced around the courtroom, her gaze meeting the uncertain faces of spectators. Some were intrigued, others horrified, but all were silent. She closed her eyes briefly, summoning a hymn her grandmother used to sing, one she had taught Angela during quiet Sunday mornings on the porch. And then, she began. The first note was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried through the room like a breeze. It was Amazing Grace. Her voice, rich and soulful, filled the courtroom with a resonance that seemed to still time itself. The haunting melody wove its way through the air, wrapping itself around the hearts of everyone listening. The judge's smug expression dissolved into something unrecognizable. Discomfort, perhaps even guilt. He shifted in his seat, but Angela's voice didn't falter. She sang each word with purpose, her eyes locking with his as if daring him to look away. Amazing Grace. How sweet the sound. That saved a wretch like me. Angela wasn't just singing. She was speaking to something deeper. She was calling out the judge's cruelty, his misuse of power, and his disregard for the humanity of those who stood before him. "I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." Her voice swelled, rich with emotion. The courtroom felt transformed, the weight of history and struggle hanging heavy in the air. Some spectators wiped tears from their eyes, while others sat frozen, transfixed by the sheer power of her performance. But Angela wasn't performing for applause. She was reclaiming her agency, her voice, and her dignity. Each note was a declaration. "You will not break me." When the final note lingered in the air, the silence was deafening. The judge's face was pale, his hands gripping the edge of his bench. The spectators sat stunned, unsure whether to breathe, applaud, or cry. Angela slowly lowered her gaze, taking her seat without another word. Judge Whittaker cleared his throat, but the sound was strained, a feeble attempt to reassert control over a courtroom he no longer commanded. "Miss Rivers," he began, his voice faltering. "That was unexpected." Angela stared straight ahead, her expression calm and resolute. "You asked me to sing, Your Honor." I sang. The tension in the room shifted. What had been a spectacle meant to humiliate her had become a moment of reckoning. For the first time, the judge seemed smaller. His authority diminished in the wake of her courage. By the time Angela left the courtroom, the story of what had happened inside had already begun to spread. Court clerks whispered to one another, lawyers murmured in the hallways, and spectators exchanged wide-eyed glances as they described the moment they'd just witnessed. Angela walked out with her head high, but her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her bag. The emotional weight of the experience hung on her like a heavy cloak. She had stood her ground in a way she hadn't anticipated, and though she felt proud, a lingering unease crept into her mind. Would her defiance bring consequences? She didn't have to wonder long. That evening, a local reporter who had been sitting in the courtroom published an online article titled, "Defiant Act Silences Racist Judge. A Black Woman's Voice Exposes Injustice in Small-Town Courtroom." The story was raw and vivid, capturing every detail. The judge's humiliating demand, Angela's soulful rendition of Amazing Grace, and the stunned silence that followed. The article went viral almost overnight. Social media platforms lit up with posts praising Angela's courage. Comments poured in, with people calling her an inspiration, a symbol of strength, and the voice of resilience. Hashtags like Ty's Amazing Grace Moment and Justice for Angela began trending. But not everyone was celebrating. Judge Whittaker sat in his study that night, his jaw clenched as he scrolled through his phone. His face twisted with anger as he read headlines accusing him of racism and abuse of power. The carefully crafted image of authority he had cultivated over decades was now under siege. The backlash didn't stop with online outrage. By the next morning, Angela's story had caught the attention of national media. News outlets began reaching out to Angela, asking for interviews, while legal experts weighed in on the implications of the judge's actions. One segment on a morning news show featured a civil rights lawyer, Maya Henderson, who didn't mince words. "This is more than an isolated incident," Maya said. "Judge Whittaker's behavior is part of a systemic problem in our justice system, one where individuals like Angela Rivers are subjected to humiliation simply because of their race. This moment, however, might just be the turning point." Angela, watching the coverage from her small apartment, felt her phone buzz incessantly with calls and messages. Some were from friends and family, offering words of encouragement. Others were from strangers, thanking her for her bravery. But a few were less kind. Angry, hateful messages from those who supported Whittaker or resented her for speaking out. She took a deep breath, her hands gripping her phone. She hadn't sought attention. All she had wanted was to challenge a ticket. But now, her defiance had ignited a fire she couldn't put out. The courthouse, once a quiet epicenter of routine cases, had become a hive of scrutiny. Protesters began gathering outside, holding signs that read, "Justice for Angela" and "End Racist Judges." Others chanted, their voices rising in unison, "No justice, no peace." Inside, Judge Whittaker felt the pressure mounting. His courtroom, once his domain, now felt like a battleground. Court officials whispered about investigations into his past rulings, fueled by the sudden public interest in his behavior. A junior clerk, emboldened by Angela's act of defiance, had anonymously submitted a formal complaint to the State Judicial Review Board, citing years of inappropriate conduct by Whittaker. The judge's composure began to crack. In meetings, he lashed out at his staff, demanding to know who had leaked information about the courtroom incident. His gavel, once a symbol of control, now felt like a hollow prop. Angela sat in her apartment, staring at an email from a national news outlet asking her to appear on a televised interview. Part of her wanted to stay quiet, to let the whirlwind die down so she could return to her normal life. But another part of her, the part that had stood tall in that courtroom, knew this moment wasn't just about her. She thought of her grandmother again, of the stories she'd told about marching for equality. "Sometimes," her grandmother used to say, "the only way to make them see is to stand where they can't look away." Angela closed her laptop, her decision made. Angela's face appeared on screens across the country as she sat down for an exclusive interview with a prominent news anchor. The studio lights were harsh, but Angela's composure never wavered. She wore a simple but elegant blouse, her curls framing her determined expression. "Angela Rivers," the anchor began, his voice steady but tinged with curiosity. "You've become the center of a national conversation about race, power, and justice. Did you ever imagine that moment in the courtroom would have such an impact?" Angela paused, choosing her words carefully. "No," she admitted, her voice steady. "When I walked into that courtroom, I just wanted to stand up for myself. I didn't expect my voice to carry beyond those walls. But I think that moment resonated because it wasn't just about me. It was about everyone who's ever been silenced, dismissed, or humiliated for no reason other than who they are." The anchor nodded, leaning forward. "Many are calling your act courageous, even revolutionary. But there are critics, those who say you were disrespectful to the court, or that your actions disrupted the legal process. How do you respond to that?" Angela's expression hardened slightly. "Respect works both ways. A courtroom should be a place where justice is served, not where people are demeaned. If standing up for my dignity disrupted the process, then maybe it's the process that needs to change. Her words struck a chord, sparking applause on social media as clips of the interview went viral. Viewers shared her story with captions like, "This is what courage looks like," and "Angela Rivers is a voice we all need right now." But with the attention came backlash. Not everyone celebrated Angela's defiance. Judge Whittaker's supporters rallied to his defense, claiming he was being unfairly targeted. Local news stations aired interviews with his colleagues, who painted him as a dedicated public servant and dismissed the accusations of racism as exaggerated. One evening, Angela received an anonymous letter in her mailbox. It read, "You've stirred up trouble where it wasn't needed. Watch yourself." Her hands shook as she read the words, her mind flashing to stories of activists who had faced threats and violence for speaking out. But instead of fear, she felt a rising anger. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about a system that thrived on silencing voices like hers. Determined not to back down, Angela reached out to Maya Henderson, the civil rights lawyer who had spoken about her case on national TV. Maya agreed to meet with Angela, and within days they filed a formal complaint with the state's Judicial Review Board, citing Judge Whittaker's history of biased rulings and inappropriate behavior. The Judicial Review Board launched an investigation into Judge Whittaker, and their findings were damning. Over the years, he had issued disproportionately harsh sentences to black defendants, dismissed evidence without cause, and maintained a pattern of behavior that pointed to racial bias. Angela's case became a lightning rod for change. Activists organized marches, calling for greater oversight of the judiciary. Protesters flooded the courthouse steps, chanting, "No more racist judges," and "Justice for Angela." The pressure mounted, and soon Judge Whittaker was forced to make a public statement. Standing at a podium in front of the courthouse, flanked by his legal team, he addressed the growing scandal. "I have always upheld the law with integrity and fairness," he began, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "The allegations against me are politically motivated and do not reflect the reality of my courtroom." But even as he spoke, the cracks in his defense were glaring. Reporters grilled him about the Judicial Review Board's findings, and footage of his courtroom behavior, including Angela's moment of defiance, circulated widely, contradicting his claims. As the case against Whittaker unfolded, Angela continued to speak out. She joined panels, appeared at rallies, and used her growing platform to advocate for systemic change. Her message was clear: this isn't just about one judge. It's about an entire system that allows people like him to thrive. Her courage inspired others to come forward. Former defendants, court staff, and even other judges began sharing their stories of corruption and bias in the justice system. Angela's voice had become a catalyst for something much bigger than she had ever imagined. As the investigation into Judge Whittaker reached its final stages, the tension in the small southern town was palpable. Every headline, protest, and rally added to the mounting pressure on the courthouse. Angela Rivers, now a prominent voice in the national conversation, found herself at the center of a growing movement for judicial reform. The state's Judicial Review Board announced a formal hearing to address the accusations against Whittaker. The day of the hearing, crowds gathered outside the courthouse, chanting slogans and holding signs that read, "End the bias," and "Accountability for all." Angela stood among them, her presence drawing cheers and applause. She wasn't just a symbol of defiance anymore. She was a symbol of hope. Inside the hearing room, Judge Whittaker sat at a long table, flanked by his lawyers. He looked tired, his once imposing demeanor reduced to nervous glances and fidgeting hands. The board members, a panel of judges and legal experts, sat across from him, reviewing the evidence that had been compiled against him. Angela, seated in the audience alongside her attorney, Maya Henderson, listened intently as witness after witness testified. A former court clerk described how Whittaker had frequently dismissed evidence submitted by black defendants without justification. A public defender recounted the judge's tendency to hand down harsher sentences to minority clients. When it was Angela's turn to speak, the room fell silent. She rose, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "I never wanted to be here," she began. "All I wanted was to contest a simple traffic ticket But what I experienced that day was not justice, it was humiliation. And I know now that what happened to me wasn't an isolated incident. Judge Whittaker has used his position to belittle, demean, and oppress those who come before him, particularly people of color. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. This isn't just about one judge or one courtroom. It's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. If we want true justice, we have to demand accountability from those in power. Her words hung in the air, met with murmurs of agreement from the audience. After hours of testimony, the review board recessed to deliberate. The crowd outside the courthouse swelled, waiting anxiously for the decision. Finally, the board returned, their expressions grave. After thorough review of the evidence and testimony presented, the lead board member announced, "We find that Judge Bernard Whittaker has violated the ethical standards required of his position. Effective immediately, he is removed from the bench and barred from practicing law in this state." The room erupted in cheers, and outside the crowd roared with approval. Angela felt tears welling in her eyes as she exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Justice, for once, had prevailed. In the weeks that followed, Angela's story continued to inspire change. State lawmakers introduced new legislation aimed at increasing oversight of judges and ensuring greater accountability in the justice system. Activists used Angela's case as a rallying point to push for nationwide reform. Angela herself became a leader in the movement. She founded an organization called Voices of Justice, dedicated to amplifying stories of those who had been silenced by systemic oppression. Through speaking engagements, advocacy work, and mentorship programs, she channeled her experience into empowering others. One evening, as Angela sat in her modest but warm apartment, she received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was shaky but familiar. It was from Judge Whittaker. The letter read, "Angela, I've had time to reflect on what happened in my courtroom and everything since. I see now how my actions were not just wrong but deeply harmful. I know I can't undo the pain I caused, but I want to thank you for opening my eyes. Your strength has changed me in ways I never thought possible, Bernard Whittaker." Angela read the letter twice, then folded it and placed it in a drawer. She didn't need his apology to validate her actions, but it was a reminder of the impact one voice could have. Months later, Angela stood on the steps of the state capitol, addressing a crowd of thousands. Her voice carried over the sea of faces, resolute and filled with purpose. "What started in one courtroom has turned into a movement," she said. "Because of all of you, we are proving that change is possible, that justice isn't just a word. It's a promise we demand for everyone." As the crowd erupted in applause, Angela smiled. She had stepped into that courtroom months ago as one woman fighting for her dignity. Now, she was the voice of a movement, a testament to the power of courage in the face of injustice. And though the road ahead was long, Angela knew she, and the countless others she had inspired, would keep walking it, one step at a time.